The darkest night in the history of the Smurl family wasn't their first night in the house, it was a night in mid-August 1986. The duplex at 328 Chase Street, West Pittston, trembled as if torn apart by an invisible fury. Ed Warren, a man who had faced hundreds of demons, stood in the living room, raising a crucifix high, his voice hoarse from shouting exorcism prayers. Lorraine, his wife, clutched her head and collapsed onto the floor, blood trickling from her nose as she whispered, "It's too strong, it will kill us all." Jack Smurl was lifted off the ground by an unseen force and hurled against the wall. His eyes rolled back, his mouth gasping as if an invisible hand was choking him. Janet, his resilient wife, rushed to embrace him, but behind her, a tall, faceless shadow emerged, its unseen hands reaching out, ready to pull her into eternal darkness. The chandelier above crashed to the floor, shattering into countless shards as a guttural, eerie laughter echoed through the house. Their children, Dawn, Shannon, and the two younger ones huddled in a corner, screaming as the temperature plummeted, turning their breath into white mist. This wasn't the first time the Smurls had encountered this malevolent force, but it was the first time it unleashed its full, merciless power. A question hung thick in the air: how did they get to this moment? And would they ever escape? It all began on a warm August day in 1973. Jack and Janet Smurl, a young couple with 4 small children, moved into the duplex at West Pittston after Hurricane Agnes devastated their former home in Wilkes-Barre. 328 Chase Street was a modest home, red brick walls, gray shingled roof, and split in half so they could live alongside Jack's parents, John and Mary Smurl. It was meant to be a fresh start, a place to heal from past losses. But none of them knew they had just walked into a trap set decades before. The first few months passed peacefully. Jack, a tall, hard-working man who had spent years working in factories, busied himself with home repairs. Janet, with her golden hair and gentle smile, devoted herself to caring for the children and her in-laws. But then, on a frigid January night in 1974, everything changed. It was a moonless night when a storm knocked out power across town. Janet stood in the kitchen, holding a candle, its flickering light casting worried shadows on her face. Then, she heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the staircase, like nails scraping against wood. "Jack," she called, but only a ragged, wheezing breath answered from the darkness. Suddenly, the candle went out, and the dishes inside the cabinets trembled violently, shattering into pieces without anyone touching them. Jack came rushing down from upstairs, a baseball bat in hand, but by the time he arrived, everything had gone silent. Only the sickening stench of rotting flesh filled the air. Janet, trembling, recounted what had happened, but Jack dismissed it, believing it was just her imagination. However, the next morning, their German Shepherd, a strong and healthy dog, was found lifeless at the bottom of the stairs, its ribs shattered, as if something unseen had thrown it with brutal force. In the weeks following that first incident, 328 Chase Street was no longer a safe haven, it became a battleground for darkness. The strange occurrences were no longer mere whispers in the night but full-blown, unrelenting torment. Heavy footsteps echoed from the attic, but they weren't the sound of boots, they were the sharp clicks of claws scraping across the wooden floor, slow and deliberate, counting down to something terrible. One night, Janet was awakened by frantic knocking on her bedroom door. When she opened it, the hallway was empty except for a streak of fresh blood smeared along the wall. As she watched in horror, the blood slowly faded, as if it had never been there. Dawn, their eldest daughter, became the next target. One rainy afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table doing her homework, the lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, Dawn screamed as deep, red scratches appeared on her arm, fresh and bleeding, as if an invisible beast had clawed at her. Janet rushed in and flipped on the light, only to find Dawn curled up, her eyes wide with terror. "Mom, it's in the mirror." Janet turned, and in the reflection of the wall mirror, a faceless shadow with glowing red eyes flickered past. From that night on, every time Janet looked in a mirror, she felt an icy breath against her neck, accompanied by the suffocating scent of sulfur. Jack, a man who had once scoffed at ghost stories, could no longer deny the truth. One night, he awoke from a nightmare, drenched in sweat, gasping that something had been sitting on his chest, heavy as a boulder, whispering vile words in a language he didn't understand. It was a deep, guttural growl, as if echoing from the depths of hell. But the worst night was when he saw it, a towering black shadow standing at the foot of his bed. No face. No hands. Only two burning red eyes glowing in the darkness. He turned on the light and screamed for Janet, but by the time she ran in, it was gone, leaving behind only a scorched mark on the wooden floor, shaped like the footprint of some enormous beast. The supernatural torment didn't stop there. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the silverware on the table began to tremble, then shot up to the ceiling before slamming into the floor as if controlled by an invisible hand. A raspy, menacing laughter echoed from the basement, mingled with the agonized moans of a woman as if someone was being tortured below. Janet rushed down the stairs, but the basement was empty. Only thick, black liquid oozed up the walls, forming distorted words, "Leave." She screamed for Jack, but before he arrived, the words melted, dissolving into a steaming, foul-smelling puddle. The terror peaked one night when Shannon, their 3-year-old daughter, was jolted awake by an icy hand gripping her ankle. She shrieked, sobbing that an old woman with wrinkled skin and milky white eyes had stood beside her bed, whispering, "You will stay with me." When Janet rushed in, she found Shannon sitting rigidly on the bed, her hair standing on end as if charged with electricity, her eyes empty and unfocused. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from under the bed. Jack flipped the mattress, and a black cloud of smoke erupted from beneath, carrying the stench of burning flesh before vanishing into thin air. By the early 1980s, the attacks had become more violent. One night, Shannon was dragged down the stairs by an invisible force. Her terrified eyes widened as she screamed, "Mommy!" "The black man!" Janet ran to her, grabbing her daughter, but as she held her close, burning red scratches appeared on her own arms, a warning. Jack could no longer deny it. He had to face the truth. Their home had been taken over by something that didn't belong to this world. Desperate, they turned to the church. A priest from the local diocese came to bless the house but found nothing unusual. He stayed the night, then left, shaking his head in doubt. Another priest, who remained anonymous, attempted an exorcism. But as he departed, the house shook, and a monstrous growl rose from the basement. Janet began to believe that whatever this thing was, it didn't just haunt their home, it followed them. Even when they went camping or stayed with relatives, the presence was still there. By 1986, the Smurls were at their breaking point. They reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, the renowned paranormal investigators who had once confronted the Amityville case. The moment Lorraine stepped into the house, her face turned pale, her eyes wide with fear. "There are 4 spirits here," she said, her voice trembling. "An old woman who means no harm, a violent young girl, a man who died in this house, and a demon controlling them all." Ed nodded, gripping his crucifix, ready for battle. Ed organized prayer sessions and placed recording devices throughout the house. He captured knocks, loud bangs, and at one point, a hissing sound like a serpent emanating from the master bedroom. But the ultimate showdown came on that fateful night in August 1986, the night the darkness unleashed its full fury. That night, rain poured in torrents, lightning slashing through the sky. Ed stood in the living room, his voice hoarse from shouting exorcism prayers. Lorraine knelt beside him, clutching her head, blood trickling from her nose as she strained to see into the spirit world. Jack was lifted off the ground and slammed against the wall, blood seeping from the corner of his mouth. Janet rushed to him, screaming, "Let him go!" But the faceless shadow reappeared, tall, unmoving, its unseen hands reaching out to drag her away. The chandelier overhead crashed down, shattering into 1,000 pieces, as a ghastly, guttural laughter filled the air. The temperature plunged, and their breath turned to mist. Lorraine collapsed, whispering, "It wants Jack, it wants his soul." Ed continued praying, his voice unwavering even as the house shook violently, as if the demon was ripping it apart brick by brick. Then, after hours of battle, the shadow vanished, leaving the Smurl family trembling on the cold, unforgiving floor. After that night, their story spread beyond West Pittston. Reporters swarmed their home, and crowds of curious onlookers gathered outside. The Smurls worked with Ed, Lorraine, and journalist Robert Curran to publish the book The Haunted, which was later adapted into a film. But the publicity came at a heavy price. Jack and Janet were exhausted by the skepticism, the mockery, the accusations of fraud. In 1988, they finally fled the house, moving to Wilkes-Barre, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. In 1989, a final exorcism was performed by an unnamed priest. Afterward, the house fell silent. No more growls. No more shadows. The Smurls declared themselves free, but the price they paid was devastating: 15 years of terror, scars that would never fully heal. The house still stands, shrouded in mist, a silent challenge to anyone who dares to step inside.